Throughout our history, we have gradually developed our natural and human resources. The progress we've made is evident as one travels around Alabama. Alabamians enjoy a higher standard of living, greater recreational opportunities, and brighter prospects of prosperity than ever before.
Education is the primary function of state government. I know that is so for the simple reason that the people of Alabama want it so. And Alabama is one of the top states in the Union in giving the largest percentage of her dollar tax intake to public education. I think we are third from the top. This speaks well, of course, for the government of the state of Alabama and its feeling about education. And of course, the government of our state reflects the attitude of the average citizen of Alabama. It is so necessary in this 20th century for the state of Alabama to continue to emphasize the needs of educational progress and to provide educational programs and systems that are available to all the people of our state, regardless of the income of their family. That is the reason Alabama has progressed so far in the last number of years, is that we've had drastic changes in our educational systems that have provided not only the finest elementary and secondary education that we could afford, but also the matter of technical schools and junior colleges and medical schools and higher institutions of learning that are second to none in the United States. The first Constitution adopted in Alabama emphasized the need for education in Alabama. And in this great industrial era in which we live, an agricultural era, it is so important that we continue to emphasize the need for progress and advancement in the field of education. And those in Alabama government will continue to do so. And as long as I am governor of the state, we will make education the #1 function of state government.
In 1798, the crumbling Spanish Empire ceded all of what is now Alabama, except the coastline to about 30 miles above Mobile, to the infant United States. Alabama became a part of the United States Mississippi Territory. After 1798, adventurous settlers from all over the United States poured into Alabama. One of these early settlers, John Pierce of Connecticut, started the first known non-sectarian school in Alabama. Pierce founded his school in 1799 at Boatyard Settlement on Lake Tensaw, just north of Mobile. Pierce taught his students by the blab method, by word of mouth, how to read, write, and do arithmetic. He soon realized that he could make his fortune elsewhere and left teaching to become a cotton dealer. In 1816, the territorial government at Natchez appropriated $500 each to St. Stephen's Academy, chartered in 1811, and Green Academy, chartered in 1812. This was the first public money used for education. Alabama continued to build on its educational heritage when it became a state on December 14, 1819. The first governor of the state, in his initial message to the legislature, stressed the need for education in Alabama. The framers of the 1819 state constitution set aside lands for the support of a state university and for the promotion of the arts, literature, and the sciences throughout the state. Federal land grants to the states for education were provided for in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance and were later applied to all lands in the Southwest of which Alabama was a part. Alabama was still a frontier state, and most Alabamians had little appreciation of the need for public education. People were generally more concerned with material progress. The University of Alabama opened in 1831. The university remained small throughout the antebellum period. It reached peak enrollment with 158 students in 1836. Traditionally, education in Alabama was for the elite, those who could afford it. Academies were established by planters and wealthy merchants who ridiculed the public school system. In many areas, wealthy families hired tutors to provide educational opportunities for their children. In other places, groups of planters joined informally to hire a teacher, construct a simple log building, and thus open a school. Sometimes the schools were called old field schools because of their location in an abandoned clearing. Public schools began in Alabama in 1852 when the people of Mobile founded a public system of education. The first of the Mobile public schools was Barton Academy. Barton Academy was named for Willoughby Barton, an extensive landowner, and was initially used by parochial schools. The school had a primary and a grammar division. The Public Education Act of 1854, modeled on the Mobile system, was introduced by A.B. Meek. The act empowered the legislature to elect a state superintendent of education for a 2-year term of office. Money was appropriated and counties were authorized to levy a 10% tax on real and personal property for the benefit of schools. Additional acts increased school funds, raised qualifications of teachers, and created a county superintendent's office. Under William F. Perry, first elected state superintendent of schools by the Alabama legislature, teachers held annual conventions in the counties. Perry tried to standardize the course of study in Alabama schools. Education was provided for Negroes during the antebellum period. Many plantations were to some extent industrial schools. Slaves learned trades. Some learned to read and write and managed the plantation in the absence of the master. The public schools in Mobile were open to blacks, and by 1860, over 100 free blacks were attending public school. In 1861, at the outbreak of the Civil War, education in Alabama was making slow but steady progress. Alabama left the Union on January 11, 1861, and the educational system in the state immediately felt the effects of secession and the resultant Civil War. Educational institutions in Alabama were hard-pressed by the war. The public or common schools practically disappeared. Women's schools continued to flourish during this period. Male colleges in Alabama suffered a great deal during the war. The enthusiasm of secession times carried many of the male college students and teachers into the Confederate Army. Conscription took most of the other teachers and students. The male academies and colleges were all but deserted. After the war, Alabamians faced the compounded problem of recovery from war and radical alien government. At first, a provisional government was established according to President Lincoln's moderate plan of Reconstruction. This government was replaced by a more radical one. The new radical government created a distinct governing body over education in Alabama. The State Board of Education was given both administrative and unlimited legislative power over the public schools. A new state constitution of 1868 also provided for free public schools and authorized several progressive taxes to finance education. Black normal schools were established to train teachers for these schools. Law still required that races be segregated. Reconstruction government existed until 1874. When Native Alabamians regained control of the state after Reconstruction, they found schools dilapidated. Attempts were made to improve education in some areas with the establishment of normal schools and teacher training colleges. Florence State Normal, Troy State, Livingston State, and Jacksonville State all began in the 1880s. They were located geographically to serve various parts of the state. The State Agricultural Mechanical College was founded at Auburn. It pioneered technical education in the state and also maintained a strong liberal arts program. It became the Alabama Polytechnic Institute in 1899. Better known today as Auburn University, it is the oldest coeducational college in Alabama. Serious educators were not able to do much during this period. State Superintendent of Education John W. Abercrombie, along with the Alabama Education Association and others, led a campaign to amend the Constitution and grant the taxing power to school districts, but they were unsuccessful. The state constitution of 1901 was a setback for public education. School districts were not given the power to tax for education purposes. The education merits of the issue were not considered, but rather the racial and economic implications. The 1901 Constitution provided for segregated schools. The practical disfranchisement of most blacks made it virtually impossible for blacks to act in their own behalf. Some progress in black education did occur as a result of Northern and religious philanthropy. Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, was established primarily through philanthropic funds, but some funds came from the state legislature and from student fees. Urban school systems developed in the early 1900s, which attracted better teachers and provided better facilities and longer school terms. Before real progress in education could occur, schools had to be organized, and the role of the various schools had to be defined to avoid overlapping and inefficiency. By 1912, under the leadership of Governor B.B. Comer, most of these educational problems were dealt with. The legislature appropriated larger sums of dollars for schools, and high schools were established in each county. Thus, the base was laid for educational awakening in Alabama. The period of 1915 to 1939 brought progress and setback to education in Alabama. Alabama's educational system lagged behind the rest of the nation due to such things as poverty, excessive numbers of children, and the unnecessary expense of a dual system of education. The progress made in black education was largely a result of philanthropic efforts. Several funds were established during this period for black education, which the state eventually supported. In 1919, a commission composed of educators from the United States Bureau of Education and other experts made a thorough survey of education in Alabama and gave its report to a state education commission. Educational advantages were shown to be unequaled between urban and rural districts and between sections of the state. Leaders in Alabama reacted to the recommendations of the commission in a positive way. The commission recommended a minimum increase of $1 million to be spent to upgrade elementary schools. Governor Thomas E. Kilby decided to meet the education emergency by making appropriations out of the state treasury. He persuaded the legislature to levy new taxes and raise property taxes. During the Kilby administration, the state spent $19,935,321 for education. Sprite Dowell, the state superintendent of education from 1918 to 1920, attempted to reorganize the educational system of the state in accordance with the recommendations of the commission. Consequently, the State Board of Education and the State Council of Education were created in 1919 to better supervise and coordinate all the state-supported schools. The State Board of Education had jurisdiction over all the schools except Alabama Polytechnic Institute, the University of Alabama, and the Alabama Technical Institute and College for Women. The Council of Education guided these schools. Before the end of Bibb Graves' first term as governor of Alabama, the greatest depression in American history began playing havoc with the educational progress made during his first 2 years. School buildings were erected and expansions were made in anticipation of funds that never materialized after the stock market crash of 1929. A large school debt accumulated, and many school terms were shortened. Conditions became much worse under Governor Benjamin Meek Miller, who succeeded Graves in 1931. During the Miller term, economic depression and the failure of the state legislature to do anything for the schools caused distressing educational conditions. The 1931 Alabama legislature cut educational appropriations and did nothing to prevent heavy proration of appropriations to the State Department of Education and to other education. Dr. A.F. Harmon, State Superintendent of Education from 1929 to 1935, expressed the situation mildly when he said, "The quadrennium has been unmarked by any notable achievements with respect to the education of the childhood and youth of the state. It has been marked by struggle for educational existence." Indeed, it was a struggle. The legislature in 1932 reduced college appropriations 30% and reduced common school appropriations 10%. Although schools probably could have adjusted themselves to these reductions, the legislature did not provide necessary funds to pay the balance. Common schools and colleges received only half of their reduced appropriations. In fact, teachers during the Depression donated several $million worth of service to the schools. According to rulings of the state courts during the Depression, the expenses of state government had to be paid first, and then whatever funds remained in the state treasury were to be distributed proportionately among the schools and other state social service institutions. This condition of affairs produced an acute crisis among the common schools in 1933 and 34, and many college professors received only a part of their already reduced salaries. Local officials cut the terms of many schools short, and a wholesale closing of schools would have resulted in January and February of 1934 if President Franklin D. Roosevelt had not poured federal money into the state through his New Deal programs. Though many substantial school buildings existed in 1930, there was a distressing lack of buildings and equipment for rural schools in many counties. During the Depression, the building, equipping, and repairing of schools was practically suspended, except for federal relief projects directed by the Civil Works Administration and the Public Works Administration. By the time of Governor Bibb Graves' return to office in 1935, New Deal programs had improved economic conditions. Under Graves, the legislature passed the Minimum School Program Law in 1935, which guaranteed a minimum school year of 7 months, a promise that he had made in his 1926 campaign. The Free Textbook Act, which furnished free textbooks through the 4th grade, was passed during Graves' term, as well as the School Budget Act, which required the preparation of a school budget in advance of a school year. Graves and the Superintendent of Education, J.A. Keller, teamed up to get a 2% sales tax passed, with the first 3/4 of the tax earmarked for education. In 1939, the legislature authorized the Alabama Public School Corporation to assist local boards of education to borrow money for current expenses in anticipation of proceeds from the Minimum Program Fund appropriation. The year 1939 was an important year for teachers. Legislation in that year guaranteed career security for teachers in the future. The legislature passed a law requiring that teachers be paid regularly in cash. The teachers' tenure law promised job security for experienced teachers, and the teachers' retirement law provided pensions for teachers. All these 1939 laws gave teachers additional security in their work. In the post-World War I years, education in Alabama made progress. The unexpected economic depression led to distressing educational conditions, but with federal money and the heroic sacrifices of school officials and teachers, education in Alabama weathered the storm. The period of 1940 to 1954 was one of renewed concern for education. Sacrifice for the sake of the war effort and a renewed effort to meet the educational needs of the children and youth of Alabama after World War II. Educational objectives shifted toward practical pursuits with emphasis on economic efficiency, particularly at the community level. The major thrust of the curriculum organization in the 1941 course of study was toward the core curriculum. The core curriculum included basic socializing experiences which all children, regardless of individual differences and interests, were to have. Few school systems adopted the recommended program completely, but some schools managed to adopt a minimal secondary core program of English and history. At the same time, the curriculum in the elementary schools began to shift from a narrow concentration on reading, writing, and arithmetic to concern for the whole child. A well-balanced program for the elementary schools provided daily living activities and the development of individual interest as well as the necessary skills. This philosophy dictated a new role for both the student and the teacher. The entry of the United States into World War II, probably more than anything else, disrupted the growth of the progressive educational philosophy in Alabama. As a result of the war, educators became less concerned with philosophy and more concerned with the practical aspects of the defense of the nation. The teaching force in Alabama, as elsewhere in the nation, was seriously depleted during the war years as hundreds of teachers left their post to volunteer for active service. Teachers leaving for war aggravated the already existing problem of a lack of teachers in Alabama. The low standards for teacher certification were lowered even more through the issuance of emergency certificates, which allowed semi-trained people to fill teacher vacancies. From July 1st, 1942 to February 15th, 1945, the State Board of Education issued over 12,000 substandard certificates to meet the emergency shortage of teachers. Higher standards for certification could not be required, however, until the supply of qualified teachers increased. A survey of Alabama schools was released in 1945. Among other things, this survey showed that in 1940, the average Alabama citizen completed only 7.1 years of school. The national average was 8.4 years. The study also indicated that 1,437 one-teacher schools existed with little equipment and supplies, and that Alabama ranked 4th from the bottom in the nation in salaries paid to teachers. With the end of World War II, Alabamians were ready to deal with the problems uncovered by the survey. The post-war period in Alabama brought new challenges and demands upon school systems and higher education. Shortages of supplies and building materials limited school construction. Even teaching materials were in short supply due to wartime shortages of paper and printing. The teacher shortage, evident throughout the war, became chronic. At the same time, the birth rate of the war period produced ever-increasing classes of beginning pupils for the schools each year. The result of all these factors was a decade of critical shortages of everything except pupils. Alabama education also was the target of a growing volume of criticism and controversy on many topics: aims, discipline, and the curriculum. One of the most significant events in Alabama education in the last 2 decades, however, was the reversal of the separate but equal policy for schools for Negro children in the state. After a lengthy series of court battles to ensure full status for black students in public institutions of higher education, the crucial case of Brown versus Board of Education came before the United States Supreme Court, when on May 17, 1954, it declared that segregation must go. The separate but equal policy established by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 was officially dead. Recognizing the revolutionary nature of its decision, the court, in a case the next year, indicated that a gradual approach to desegregation would be acceptable. The dual school system in Alabama was further dismantled by Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which barred discrimination in all federally aided projects and programs throughout the country. This act was particularly effective since virtually every school district in the United States received some federal aid. The launching of Sputnik 1 in 1958 by the Russians caused the federal government to begin pumping money into all state and local educational institutions to ensure trained manpower to catch the Russians in scientific development. Title III of the National Defense Education Act, passed in 1958, authorized matching grants of federal funds to states to equip and remodel school labs and classrooms, and to improve services in science, mathematics, and modern foreign languages. This act, which grew out of a seemingly national emergency, marked the beginning of a new trend in education in Alabama as in other states. Between 1958 and 1974, Alabama received and matched some $18 million in federal funds under NDEA. In 1965, Congress authorized another general program of financial assistance through the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It, too, included guidelines categorized under several major titles. Under Title I, local school systems in Alabama received $346 million in 9 years between 1966 and 1974 for the education of children from low-income families or children who were otherwise educationally deprived. This money financed programs mostly in the areas of mathematics and reading. Title II of ESEA provided funds for school library resources, textbooks, and other instructional materials such as audio-visual materials and various printed materials. Prior to 1974, Alabama received $12.5 million under Title II. Title III of ESEA aided the establishment of supplementary educational centers for academic enrichment and programs such as guidance and counseling, health services, remedial instruction, and innovative exemplary programs. Money from Title III and other areas of ESEA helped fund the Right to Read program, intended to eliminate functional illiteracy in the country. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, together with NDEA, profoundly affected education within Alabama. The enormous amounts of federal money expended in the state brought educational supplies, equipment, and services for the students, which the schools alone could not provide. Has initiated several specialized programs to help remedy specific problems in Alabama. local initiative caused other recent curriculum changes. State-sponsored changes in curriculum included additions to the social studies curriculum, educational television, the development of special education, adult basic education, and the expansion of the vocational education program. The State Board of Education and its administrative agency, the State Department of Education, has played a major role in the present-day development of the state school system. The State Board of Education receives its powers and authority from the legislature and is composed of the governor, who serves as its president, and 8 members. The State Superintendent of Education, who is appointed by and serves at the pleasure of the board, is secretary and executive officer. When the board was created in 1919, the members of the board were appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate for 6-year terms. Since 1971, the members are elected, one from each of the old congressional districts, for 4-year terms, with half of the membership elected every 2 years. The State Board of Education establishes policies and exercises general control and supervision over the public schools of Alabama, over state-owned junior colleges and technical institutions. Mainly, the board exercises its duties and responsibilities through the state superintendent and the State Department of Education. It adopts rules and regulations governing various facets of public education, including training and certification of teachers, prescribes courses of study for the public schools, equalizes public school facilities insofar as possible, adopts budgets, and recommends legislation for all agencies under its control. The story of higher education in Alabama since 1954 is one of changes and developments to meet the growing needs and demands of the Alabama people and culture. For instance, the state now has increasingly large numbers of schools and colleges to support. This is in keeping with a national trend to bring college-level courses closer to the homes of students. The college curriculum in Alabama has gradually expanded and grown. Accompanying this expansion and seemingly diametrically opposed to it has been the movement to increase specialization and to narrow the scope of the college curriculum. In essence, however, what resulted is that many colleges and universities in the state have endeavored to provide a broadened curriculum with specially designed courses in most major areas of learning for all students. In this manner, all graduates might be expected to gain a balanced education plus a modern specialized field. Throughout the years, private education has continued to be a major aspect of Alabama's total education framework. Before the advent of free public education, private institutions and religious or sectarian institutions were the primary means of educating youth. Basically, these institutions are intended to serve the special interest or purposes in the community and provide the type of instruction desired by the parents. Because they educate so many youth, the private schools save the state thousands of dollars each year and relieve crowded conditions within the public schools. Funding education has always been a problem for Alabama, yet each year more and more money is spent. In 1973, money appropriated for education from both federal and state sources paid for 97.5 million lunches and over 6 million breakfasts served to students in 1,313 public schools, paid for the transportation of about 400,000 students at a cost of almost $47 a year per pupil transported. It provided salaries for over 31,000 teachers and other state educational personnel, textbooks, school plant construction and maintenance, and numerous other expenses. The state provides 63.3% of the total revenue, and the federal government provides 15.6%. The remainder comes from county, district, and other funds, including philanthropic donations and school fees. Since the 1945 survey, Alabama has made great progress in education. But because the whole nation made large strides during the same time, Alabama still lags behind most other states, with many of the same educational problems still existing. Overcrowded conditions in the schools, for example, represent a constant problem in some areas of the state. These crowded conditions are due to the large increase in urbanization, as 1/2 of Alabama's citizens now live in cities. Integration forced some schools to close and others to consolidate. Some of the overcrowding in Alabama schools, however, is a result of positive factors. For example, education is more highly valued by Alabama citizens. The compulsory education law is more strictly enforced, and the dropout rate is declining. Consequently, there are more Alabama youths attending schools. Today, all forms of education have real significance in Alabama. Since the first hardy settlers established crude schools in the wilderness around Mobile, education has been an important factor in the progress of Alabama and its citizens.